and editor of International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. For another speaker of us, Professor Jonathan Rigg. He is chair in Human Geography School of Geographical Science, University of Bristol, and he has been elected as the fellow of the prestigious British Academy. And we are honored to have both of you here. Please help me welcome Professor Hyun and Professor Jonathan by sending any emoji or something, sending some message in the chat. So I will hand the microphone to Professor Hyun and Professor Jonathan. Please welcome.
Well, thank you so much for this very kind introduction and for also having me and Jonathan here in this seminar. I hope everyone can see the cover image of the slide that we have prepared. So the next 45 minutes will be spent on basically on these contents. We are trying to cover these topics. And hopefully 45 minutes will be more sufficient to go through each of these points that you see on the slide. So we'll start by looking at finding a journal to publish, why publish in international journals and open access publication. Then move on to subsequent topics such as think about co-authorship. And you may heard about what predatory heard about predatory journals, and it'll be helpful to briefly discuss what they are, and also publishing and building a profile, responding to reviewer comments, and a few final points to take away. So I'll try to cover the first half, and Jonathan will be covering the second half. So, as a starting point, finding a journal has been an easy task for some, but also a difficult task for many others. And here, I guess, a few bullet points to mind each one of us, which will be including, first of all, should I publish in my own language or in English, if English is different from your own language? Also, should I publish in an area studies journal or in a disciplinary journal? So there are area studies journals such as Critical Asian Studies, Journal of Contemporary Asia, and also there are disciplinary or interdisciplinary journals such as Urban Geography, Urban Studies, Singapore Journal for Tropical Geography, and so on and so forth. So there are these different types of journals, and one may have to think about what it means to publish your output in an area studies journal and in a disciplinary journal. Each one has a different target audience. The writing styles are a little different, and also what each output from each type of journals will be also making some contributions or sometimes significant contributions to your own career advancement as well. Publishing in one type of journal effectively means you are basically territorializing your scholarship and speaking to a particular group of audience, and also building up your own profile and your identity as well. So choosing which journal to go for can be quite important. Publishing your own language is also going to be quite important, of course, to speak to your domestic audience. While at the same time, there's a particular need of publishing in English in international journals, and this is probably where we are going to focus on today. Talking about publishing in international journals doesn't undermine the importance of publishing in domestic journals, and that's something we just want to highlight before we go further. There are also a few considerations and sometimes very practical considerations, such as looking at the journal impact factor released by Social Science Citation Index, run by Clarivate. And it's also useful to also consider Scopus in a journal metrics. And of course, many of you will be aware of the expressions such as Q1 or Q2 journals. These are often important considerations when it comes to your own career advancement or promotion within your own institutions. Where you publish, especially those in the highly reputable journals, which are usually in the groups of Q1, Q2. In other words, top 25%, where the top 25% of the journals based on the citation standing, or top 50% of the journals based on the journal metrics, will be quite important given their reputation and also given the way these journals attract certain types of audience. However, journal metrics or citation scores are not the only reputation to consider. There are many journals which may not be in the top 10 or top 5 of the journal citations list, while still gaining a large degree of reputation as well. And also, certain journals may score very highly in journal metrics, but may not be as reputable as other journals. Is in terms of how they are being recognized in the discipline. So it will be quite useful to actually look at both metrics for practical considerations, while at the same time you ask around your more experienced colleagues to see whether the choice of journal you have identified is actually the right journal for your own need. Very importantly, always think about who's your target audience. Further issues to consider will be these. First of all, how quickly do I need to have my findings published? Some journals obviously have reputations for taking such a long time to get published. I had a PhD student of mine who was really eager to and happy to publish in a journal. But the journal took probably much longer than what one would have usually expected. They have taken, I can't remember exactly, but at least 1 year to get the first review and a comment back to the author, which is considered to be much longer than the industry average. So there are certain reputations some journals carry, and it will be helpful to actually again ask around what they what the practices of each journal turn out to be by making inquiries among your colleagues. What I wish to achieve by publishing my paper is one thing very important considerations for own intellectual growth and also for career advancement. So here, there will be also related considerations such as, do I have to publish or access, do I have to publish in open access journals, or do I have access to funding for open access publication as well in order to make that happen, given that open access publication does come with some cost implication, something we'll be covering a little more later on today. The length of your output is also going to be an important consideration, given that each journal will have their own policy in terms of how many word count they are able to accommodate. It's often somewhere between 8,000 to 10,000 words, and these may include the list of references and footnotes. Sometimes one image may count as 250 words or 300 words, depending on how the journal policy turns out to be. So have a careful read of author guidelines in order to understand what the journal is expecting you to address and how you are to edit your paper. Very often authors may go for certain journals because they allow longer paper. If you especially have a lot of findings that you feel like they can't fit into a shorter paper, and therefore choosing journals that would accommodate a longer paper will be part of practical considerations. Studying the journal you're submitting your paper to is therefore very important. As I was saying, study the author guidelines, but also more importantly, study what the journal says in terms of the scope of research they prefer to publish. Very often, and here I speak as one of the editors of International Journal of Urban and Regional Research that I edit, a large number of desk reject may happen because papers are submitted without really considering what the journal is focusing on. So I also had a paper desk rejected when I submitted to an international journal, and it was desk rejected within a few days actually, which I really appreciated, because you don't have to wait in a long weeks and days and weeks to get the initial outcome. The desk rejection reason was because the paper, although I thought it was fitting in the journal, wasn't really fitting into the journal according to the editor's letter, based on their current interest. So it was basically desk rejected in order for us to basically send it to another paper as soon as possible, which is the reason I really appreciated. So that can happen even though you study quite extensively. But nevertheless, it will be useful to study the journal as much as possible to reduce the risk of being desk rejected. Now, a few reminders in terms of why we publish. It will be meaningful to publish in international journals. So one obvious reason is wider dissemination of research output beyond the domestic audience. Also, it's important for one's career advancement, especially as the academic world has become has come to be quite global. It's also important from the university point of view in terms of promotion of the university's reputation. So the more papers that you publish in English and therefore get cited, your researchers, university employees, and being recognized in the field, and it does contribute to the raise of university reputation. Promoting the presence of national research in the international scholarly field is probably something I would emphasize to be very important. Also, connected issues, the promotion of the ownership of national research. These are very important from my point of view, largely because there's the demand for having the voices of researchers from outside the global north to be heard in the international scholarly field, which is to contribute to the decentering knowledge production. So rather than the research being carried out by foreigners and who publish on what's going on in your own country, it will be important to have the researchers being part of the publication by co-authoring or by authoring themselves in order to disseminate and have their research findings recognized by the international audience, and therefore having greater presence of such domestic researchers without foreign researchers basically dominating the field. As I was saying, please do study the journal, and here is just an example of our iJournal that I'm editing. So here it basically says we are expecting to receive manuscripts which are to advance concept, and here critical urban studies concept and methodologies in the interdisciplinary field of urban studies, and to demonstrate the expansion of knowledge through research and theory. So we prefer, in the case of iJournal, to publish papers which are really addressing and challenging the existing urban scholarship by engaging with conceptual issues or by sharing the latest findings from which new concepts or revision of the existing concepts can be promoted. So those are the kind of papers that we look for, and therefore the more a paper is touching this area of study, the more likely for them to be receiving the editor's attention. Now, moving on to open access publication. So increasingly nowadays, you may see open access publication being one of the hot topics in this publishing field and also in academia. So usually existing journals can be divided into a hybrid journal and a full open access journal. So the conventional journals, which are already established in the field, will be mostly falling into this hybrid journal category, while there are new journals which have been established by publishers and other scholarly bodies as fully open access journals. So full open access journals are something that you probably need to study a little more than other conventional journals in order to verify their credibility. And this is where our seminar today, which will be also including the issue of predatory journals, can be quite relevant. So some of these in open access journals can be subject to big questioning, although not all of them are. So open access publication often involves the payment of what is known as article processing charge, or APC in short, and the price can vary from one journal to another. So hybrid journals will also be publishing some of their papers as open access papers, and this also involves the payment of APC, or article processing charge. Fully open access journals will be publishing all their papers as open access papers, and most of their papers in fully open access journals will be involving the payment of APC. Now, this article processing charge is in principle to be paid by you as an author. But sometimes, if you have a research grant from a funding body, then the research in the grant awarding body may have additional budget to cover the open access publication and therefore pay the APC on your behalf. Or your institution might be part of a larger consortium, or your institution may have their own budget to support their researchers to publish your papers as open access by basically covering the APC using their budget. So it will be important to find out what is available to you in terms of funding to cover the open access publication expenses. Probably useful to look at what is known as a ESAC initiative, which stands for Efficiency and Standards for Open Access Article Charges, and they actually compile the list of all these agreements which publishers have signed with each country and universities. So these are known as transformative agreements, and these are very important because this is basically allowing researchers to have access to open access and publication funding. Such agreements are made between publishers and universities or research institutions or funding bodies in each country, and who are involved will be different from one country to another. What is important about these agreements is that it assumes that it basically puts together a certain amount of funding for each year that researchers who are being part of the institutions which sign these agreements can have access to. So let me kind of show some examples. So this is the actual website, the transformative agreement page. And here, if you just look at the agreement registry, and this is where all the list of existing agreements can be found. And if you just go there, maybe let me just show this example here. So if you kind of look at this and click on the agreement registry, you can basically search by using country name or the publisher. And here, I just took the example of one publisher, which is very well known for open access, fully open access publication. I think it might be actually useful if do we have time? Yes, just to have a look at the actual website here. Yes, I see initiatives. Just one sec. And let me just share this screen again to my browser. So I hope you can see the browser here. And here how it works is, and I just click on the transformative agreement and look at the agreement registry. And here, basically, if you can kind of look for what agreements exist, and in the UK by simply typing this, and you may see that there are many agreements which involve all these publishers, which are either scholarly associations or commercial publishers like Brill, or university presses, who have signed these agreements. So what this actually means is, for example, if you kind of scroll down further down here, SAGE, which publishes the journal called Urban Studies. Then if you are part of the universities which have signed which are included in the JISC agreement, and here you click on this SAGE and look at the entire list, and simply click on this one, and this will show, and the Word document will show the list of universities which are covered by this arrangement between JISC and the SAGE publisher. And if you are an employee working for one of these universities, then when you have a paper accepted by Urban Studies and you have authored this paper as a corresponding author, then basically, as long as the funding remains, you can have your paper published as open access by Urban Studies on the basis of this agreement between SAGE and JISC that has your university as a member. So that's how it usually works. And here, let me just go back. And this is another example. Each publisher will also have their own web page that shows what sort of agreements they actually retain. So sometimes the ESAC initiatives list may not be entirely complete. It needs to be updated by voluntary submission of these new agreements. So it'll be useful also just to cross-check and visit the publisher website to see what which journals they actually cover and which country they actually cover. What is also probably useful to understand is because of this kind of a situation, publishers will go for they basically make these agreements with scholarly bodies and local institution funding bodies in each country. And if you kind of type Thailand, for example, basically there's none, which is reflecting. And if you also type Singapore, for example, also there's none either. Whereas Wiley has very recently signed open access publication agreement with the National University of Singapore. So a researcher in National University of Singapore who is going to publish in a journal published by Wiley will be able to have access to funding provided by the National University of Singapore to have their papers published as open access. Many countries in the global south, including Southeast Asia, will not be having these agreements, and this basically reflects very unequal situations in the publishing industry and also in the academic world as well. Basically, these publishers go for having agreements in those countries where the larger share of contributing authors may be found. So one of the things that I guess we may have to probably think about is how you can actually lobby your own government and your own university to have some funding allocated for enabling open access publication by researchers within your country. This is just one example of what the article processing charge looks like. So as I said, the amount of IAPC varies from one journal to another. And this is just an example of mine and a publication I was able to, a paper I was able to publish in a journal called City, which is run by Taylor and Francis. One paper basically is costing £2,375 as a UK-based researcher. So that amount may change a little bit depending on where you are, I assume. But basically, this is something I would have paid out. I had to pay out of my own pocket if I were an independent researcher and wanted to have it published by the journal City. But because of this Taylor and Francis agreement with the University Consortium in the UK, which LSE is part of, and therefore this is basically covered by my LSE, my university LSE, and therefore I had to do nothing. Basically, the publisher sends the invoice to university here, and in this case to the university library, and they basically look at how much funding they still have, and if they still have funding available, basically saying, yes, we are happy to cover this based on this agreement. So this was basically paid by my university, and the paper being published as open access. Some publishers operate as full open access in a standing-alone journals, and this is one journal example, which is urban planning. I know some of my colleagues have published in urban planning, and they basically charge 950 euros for papers up to 8,000 words, and slightly more for papers which are more than 8,000 words. So in this case, as I was showing earlier, and this public publisher doesn't really have many publication agreements, for open access publication with different various countries or other funding bodies. I mean, they are standing alone open access in the journals. One exception is these two universities I was able to find in the Netherlands, and they basically have persuaded the universities such as Utrecht University in the Netherlands to allocate some funding for researchers who want to publish in urban planning. Other than these, basically any researcher who wants to publish in urban planning will have to pay this out of their own research budget. And here, if I may just briefly remind everyone about the journal publishing submission process, and something I suppose you are all very familiar with. Start with submission, which goes through initial editor's screening, who may decide whether to desk reject it or to send it to peer reviewers. After peer reviewing process, basically the editors will decide whether the paper is going to be accepted or rejected. In most cases, almost 99% will be requiring some degree of revision, either full revise and resubmit, or minor revision or major revision before acceptance. And then the paper being revised by the author and being resubmitted, and it may go through peer review if it's a major revision. If it's very minor revision, acceptance subject to minor revision, then maybe editors may decide to basically handle this on their own without sending it to further peer review, although that can be very small minority case. The reason for showing all of these is really, the publishing is practically on waiting game. And it does take several weeks and months for peer review to be completed. So normally you may expect to hear from the editors from the journal within about 2 to 4 weeks when it comes to desk rejection, the initial screening process. The peer review process may usually take 3 to 4 months, but it can also take 6 months. I have a paper at the moment which is being considered by an international housing journal, which is now reaching 6 months time for peer review, and I haven't heard it. And the reason being, the difficulty in finding peer reviewers, and therefore editors spending longer time than other papers. Sometimes reviewers may themselves take much longer period for various reasons. And therefore, it really depends on a number of factors for paper taking longer than usual. Then paper may also take a long time based on authors' own circumstances. There are many authors who take much longer than usual time taken required for for revision and resubmission. Journals would usually expect 6 months for revised papers to be resubmitted, but authors may take longer than 6 months very easily. And when that happens, the only thing you need to do is basically reach out to the journal editor or managing editor, just ask for extension. Most journals will say yes to your extension request. Now, One final thing to review it before I hand over to Jonathan is what it means to publish your paper as a working paper. Working paper would fall into the category of what is known as preprint. Preprints are preliminary work in progress versions before final publication, and doesn't have what is known as DOI numbers, or permanent digital object identifiers. It may also include the submission version of a paper that you submit to a journal before they get fully accepted and published. So these are known as preprint, and nowadays it's quite recommended to have your preprint available on preprint server, especially for some disciplines in natural science or engineering or medical science. It's quite a common practice to have your preprint on those preprint server. Nowadays, UK universities also encourage basically require their researchers to have submission version of their paper when papers are accepted to be submitted to university server to have it available as preprint. Working papers can be quite useful for receiving feedback before they get fully revised and accepted by a journal. But it will be useful also to check with each journal whether they accept working paper versions or preprint versions when it comes to journal submission. As far as I understand, most journals will be happy to do this, and there are university publishers' preprint policy that you can find on each publisher's website. And all these policies that you see will be basically saying it's okay to submit preprint to their journals for consideration. But each journal may sometimes have their own local policy, and therefore, if you want to be 100% sure, the best strategy is just to reach out to journal editors and ask whether they accept working papers when it comes to submission. Finally, co-authorship is something you need to probably determine. I would probably suggest that you determine this as soon as possible rather than at the late stage. It will be useful to decide who is going to be the corresponding author, who will be basically in charge of communication with the publishers. Because of the open access publication issue, that depends very much on who the corresponding author is, and also where the corresponding author is located, because that's determining where the funding is going to be coming from. There can be sometimes practical consideration in terms of choosing a corresponding author who can have access to open access publication or open access funding. Sometimes the order of authors can be based on alphabetical order of author surnames, and this often happens in the disciplines, in certain disciplines such as economics. At other times, the order of authors will be based on the weight of their contributions. So it'll be useful to know what the practices are in your field and basically follow the protocol, but also having the discussion, honest discussion with your co-authors about the need of your own need, and also make sure that everyone understands this and happily agree to the arrangement that they have produced. Sometimes some universities will emphasize that in order for your paper to be acknowledged recognized for your promotion case, they require the author to be either first author or corresponding author. This was the case of one of my colleagues who is working in Chinese university, and they simply require papers that which are to be considered for promotion cases to be involving only those papers that the colleague is acting as first author or as corresponding author. So that also will be some considerations to be made among co-authors. Does the author name or the corresponding author influence editorial decisions? Some colleagues, especially early career colleagues, sometimes ask me, is it important to have corresponding author your supervisor or very influential person in the field, and whether that increases the chance of having the paper accepted? My own understanding, practice, and also my own position as editors basically say it doesn't. it really is important to have a paper of high quality and for the paper to be accepted, not the names of authors. So read the publisher's guidance on co-authorship, especially increasingly there seems to be in a publishers in a new practice, such as what is implemented by Elsevier, where they have these policies and guidelines on how to credit authors and a contribution. So this is basically what it says on the publisher's website, Elsevier's website. I recently had to resubmit a revised paper, and in the process of revising and resubmission, they were asking what each contributing author was responsible for. So this is an example from the website, but I also had to do basically the same thing with my co-author and who was doing contributing to conceptualization, methodological, the actual data collection, who was doing the data collection, or who was doing the analysis, who was doing the writing, and so on. So this is something nowadays publishers seem to be increasingly asking in order to ensure each author gets the right credit that they deserve. So apologies for taking a little longer than I thought, and here I hand over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Hyun. That was fantastic. You've left me an easy task, which is good. So it's a real pleasure to be with you all, and I have this opportunity for Hyun and I to kind of do this double act on publishing. I mean, Hyun covered most things. Just a couple of things that came to mind while he was talking. I think sort of most of the journals that Hyun and I publish in, and I suspect most on this Zoom call, will be double-blind refereed. So in other words, we don't know, the author doesn't know who the referees are, and the referees don't know who the author or authors are. There are some disciplines where it's single-blind. So where the authors don't know who the referees are, but the referees know who the authors are. Often in the natural sciences. So I've occasionally reviewed papers where the authors' names are revealed. And the explanation for that, I mean, to my surprise, the explanation for that by kind of colleagues who are natural scientists are that occasionally it is useful to know that an author, say, is a senior scholar with a long track record. It means that when you referee, you have a different sort of mindset. I think among social scientists, that's regarded as, I suppose, tipping the balance towards established scholars rather than giving free rein to early career scholars. Second thing, I mean, Hyun said he's got a paper that's 6 months in review. I had a paper published last year that took 18 months from submission to publication. So and normally I think if you like, the more prestigious the journal, probably the longer it takes. So that's something to bear in mind when you're thinking of going forward for promotion, the need maybe to have a paper published in the next 6 months, 8 months or whatever, that there is a very wide variation. And even journals that claim to turn things around quickly, my experience is that they often don't necessarily stick to their claims on the website. And then the last thing to say before I continue with the presentation is that it is sometimes possible to publish papers and then include those papers in books. So if you're writing so say you've completed a PhD, you've got a couple of papers from the PhD published, but you want to turn the PhD into a monograph. Say, for example, some publishers will allow 2 or 3 of the chapters to have been previously published. That varies between publishers, so you need to check, but it is sometimes possible to, if you like, almost recycle a previously published paper in a journal as a chapter in a book with due recognition, of course. Okay, I will now go through the slides. You can see on this one, I'll have to ask Hyun to take me forward. I hope that's okay. I'm going to focus on 3 things. The issue of predatory journals, how you build a publication profile, and how you deal with sort of refereeing. And I shouldn't think this will take more than 10 minutes or so, so I think we'll probably stick to time. So Hyun, can I have the next slide, please? Okay. Well, when I started publishing, I don't think there was anything such thing as a predatory journal, and they're proliferated over the last, I'd say, 5 or 10 years. And I suspect that many of you on this call have had emails from journals, possibly journals you've never heard of, saying, please submit, we're happy to publish your work and so on. And I think you need to be very careful about just sort of jumping in. They normally charge to publish, and their refereeing practices aren't up to the standards of journals like, say, Hyun's IJA. They are commercial enterprises that try to turn over large numbers of papers, and they make profit by charging us as scholars to publish. And there's obviously a sort of gray zone, because of course some established journals, well, most established journals, you can pay to have them open access, but there are also these open access so-called predatory journals, which exist, which means that it's occasionally quite hard to work out what is predatory and what isn't. But I think for all of us, if we're interested in publishing in reputable journals, we need to be kind of conscious and really dig in to make sure that we're not being taken for a ride. This slide here is from a paper that was published in Nature in 2019. And you can maybe see the title at the bottom, Predatory Journals, No Definition, No Defense. And I've included the definition that they come up with in this slide here. Can I have the next slide, Hyun? So this is from the same journal, and this is their attempt to, if you like, work out the span, if you like, globally of predatory as opposed to legitimate journals. So the legitimate journals are in blue on the right-hand side, and you can see there are 20,000 plus such journals shaded in blue. And then on the left, in sort of various forms of sort of orange, we've got round about 10,000 so-called predatory journals. And then we've got a number where it's sort of unclear. So maybe there are, and I think predatory journals, my kind of gut feeling is that they are expanding at a greater rate than legitimate journals. So maybe the balance is shifting year to year. But it does mean there are a lot of predatory journals. There were listings of them, but the predatory journals themselves have said they're going to take such listings, or the authors of such listings, to court. So some of those have been removed, which means, of course, it's quite hard to find out what is predatory and what isn't. So I suppose the recommendation here is sort of do your homework, make sure that you don't end up publishing a really good paper in a journal that may not do your career a great deal of good. Next slide, Hyun. Okay, building a profile. I've taken this from a presentation that I organized when I was at the National University of Singapore. And we got Tom Bernastorff, who was the editor of American Anthropologist, to give a talk to early career researchers on publishing. And he said that there's a journal triangle that maybe, I think probably most of us try to develop. And we engage with a discipline. I mean, for Hyun and myself, it's geography, but some of you may be sociologists or anthropologists or whatever. We often have an area or region that we work on. So it may be North America, Southeast Asia, Japan, whatever. And then we have a kind of thematic interest. So Hyun's, broad theme is urban studies. My broad theme is agrarian studies. And within that, there will be sub-themes and subfields. And I think for most of us, we can place our publications at different points within this triangle. So if we can just go to the next, there we go. So this is me. Oh, this one. Yeah, thanks, Hyun. Sorry, Hyun, can you go back to that triangle? There we go. So I'm a geographer. That's my discipline. And I try and publish in geography journals. If you like, the general geography journals, things like the Annals of the Association of American Geographers, the Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers, and so forth. And that's playing to my mainstream disciplinary kind of audience, people who may not be interested in my theme or my area of interest, but are, I want to talk to them and communicate with them as geographers. Then I have my area or region, Southeast Asia. I mean, I do a little bit of work on South Asia, but I think I'm mostly known as a Southeast Asianist. So I published in journals like, in fact, one that Hyun mentioned, Critical Asian Studies. I published there, Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, Asia Pacific Viewpoint. These are regional journals which are read by specialists on the region. And that's, if you like, another audience that I try to talk to. And then my themes, I'm interested in agrarian change. So I publish in journals like the Journal of Rural Studies, the Journal of Peasant Studies. And that's my, if you like, my third audience. And often people who publish it, say, who read Journal of Peasant Studies won't be geographers. They won't read my geographical work. They may not be interested in Southeast Asia, so they may not read that, and vice versa. And I think all of you, as you build a career, I mean, some of you are probably pretty senior and have your career already evolved. For those of you who are earlier on, you may think about having a publication strategy where, each year you try and engage with these different authors and target different journals. And of course, if you target different journals, you're speaking to a different audience, and you're making, if you like, you're using often the same research to argue points or positions or constructing theoretical arguments for different audiences requiring different literatures and so forth. So I think it's kind of worth thinking about this journal triangle when it comes to, if you like, the evolution of your publication strategy over time. So I put here, a career is not built on a single paper. So think about, if you like, the medium-term publication strategy. Next slide, Hyun. Okay, I've added this in because not always, but often as reviewers, so referees. So I maybe referee a paper every 2 or 3 weeks or something like that. I've got 2 that I'm having to referee at the moment, one in development studies and one in agrarian studies. So, and some journals give you sort of, if you like, hot tips, guidance notes as to, as a referee, what are the things that they're asking you specifically to look at. And I have 2 here, one for the Review of International Political Economy, RIPE, and the other for the Singapore Journal of Tropical Geography. And they're all kind of touching on, or so both of these are touching on the same set of questions. So referees are asked, what is the contribution of the paper to the discipline or to the field? They're specifically wanting to know, how is this pushing back knowledge in a particular area? So for, say, for Hyun's journal, IJA, it'll be, how does this paper take urban studies in a new direction? How does it illuminate a new or a novel way of thinking about things? They'll ask about methods. Are they robust? Do they stand up to scrutiny? They'll ask about presentation. Yeah, sometimes, are the tables appropriate? Is the length correct? They'll ask questions about engagement with the literature. So is all the relevant literature that speaks to this debate adequately represented? So as a referee, we're often asked, well, I'm surprised that, Hyun's work on this is not referenced because it speaks to the direct, concerns of this paper. Analysis and interpretation, obviously very important. Does it go far enough? Is the analysis appropriate to the evidence that's supported, that's presented? And then the aims and objectives. Yeah, so these are all questions that referees are asked to comment on. Sometimes you're sent an explicit set of kind of considerations to take into mind. On other occasions, it's left open. But these are the things that you need to think about when you're putting your paper together. Have I adequately met all of these sorts of requirements? Next one, Hyun. Okay, I've just got two examples of refereeing experience. So this was published in, I think it was in Nature, about, if you like, the journey of a paper which started in 2012. So this was someone who had a PhD from Carleton University in Canada. So she submitted her paper to Science. It was desk rejected, and Hyun talked about desk rejection earlier. Then she submitted to the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, again, desk rejected. Next one. Then to Ecology Letters, desk rejected. Then to the proceedings of the Royal Society B. It was sent out for review, and it was rejected after 2 months. So it got past the desk rejection, but no further than that. Then to PLOS One, again, rejected after 2 months, but resubmission was invited. Next one. She then resubmitted it to PLOS One. It was sent to a different reviewer. Major revisions. It was revised, resubmitted. At last, it was accepted. Next one. So it was 23 months from initial submission to Science, which is a top-ranked journal, probably has a 5% publication rate, something like that, or acceptance rate, to being published in PLOS One, which is also a very good journal. So 23 months. So I suppose what this shows you is you've got to keep plugging away. I mean, even as established scholars, it takes, I mean, I get regularly rejected. Hyun perhaps not, maybe kind of sails through without rejections, but I mean, I get rejected. And as I said, the paper that we published last year, it took 18 months. It was published in World Development in the end, but it went around the houses and around the houses. So you've got to be patient. And I suppose what this example, maybe it's an extreme example, but if you need to get a paper published in fairly short order, whether it's for promotion or for your PhD, you've got to think hard about where you send it. You send it to Science or Nature, and it has a 95% rejection rate. Yeah, so you probably, other journals, it's 75% rejection rate or 60%. Yeah, so there are variations. Okay, next slide, Hyun. Yeah, this is just, this is a kind of, I mean, you've got to be patient is one lesson about refereeing. You've also got to develop a thick skin. So these are two referees' reports, or I've extracted from two referees' reports from a paper that I sent out for review, I mean, a long time ago now, but you can see this is referee number 2. He liked the paper, or she, I don't know who it was double-blind refereed. Interesting, welcome, very good paper, congratulations to all concerned, rich, illuminating, sensitively written, blah, blah. And when I read this, I thought, yes, this is home run, I'm going to get this one in. But then the next slide, Hyun. This was the other referee. Brim with the jargon of postmodern critical geography, a small and obscure, mostly American academic enterprise. It has more in common with journalism than solid research. Had the authors been able to interview a large homogeneous sample of people rather than a rather opportunistically chosen small sample of informants, they might have had something interesting to say. They cannot make credible statements. This is interesting journalism. It is not science. No consideration. Yeah. So I suppose what I'm saying here is that referees can, come away with completely different views as to whether a paper makes a significant contribution, whether it's robust, and so on. And sometimes referees, under the cloak of anonymity, can be pretty brutal. And I mean, this is an example of a brutal referees' reports. And what you can also see here in these two referees' reports is a very different way of valuing evidence. I think referee 2, reading between the lines, is probably a qualitative researcher who is willing to accept the use of interviews and ethnography, whereas I think referee 1 wanted a sample survey, a randomly chosen, statistically significant survey of respondents. So what these two referees reflect, I think, are different ways of, if you like, doing research. But I suppose for us, or if you like, the other lesson, the main lesson here is be willing, well, not be willing, but be ready for rejection, and also be ready for some quite hard-hitting referees reports at times. Next slide, Hyun. So final set of points, and then I'll round off. Well, I put here, show your paper to colleagues, get other people to read them. I think, sadly, I think you have to be, having put that, you've got to be a little bit careful. One of my PhD students, I was with her in the field, actually, in Nepal, and we were sitting just checking our emails, and her face went white. And I said, oh, what's wrong? And she said, I've just been sent a paper to review, and I wrote it. Yeah, so someone had stolen her paper and had submitted it under their own name. So having put, do share your paper to colleagues, you know, present your ideas at conferences. I'm also conscious that, sadly, I think it's maybe on the rise that people do, you know, if you like, steal ideas. And in the case of this PhD student of mine, steal not just ideas, but steal whole papers. You can occasionally, well, I'd be interested to see what Hyun says. I put here, make contact with the editorial or editorial assistant. I mean, often you can work out from the website whether your paper speaks to the interests of a journal, and look at past issues of the journal. In your covering letter to an editor, you can say, you know, I'm engaging with this debate, and I notice that you've got earlier papers that also, but I'm, you know, engaged with this debate, but I'm taking it forward in a new way. But I think if you do have kind of questions, you can occasionally approach the editorial assistant. I don't know if Hyun likes that or has that occur or not. Maybe we can find out in a moment. Don't submit your paper to more than one journal at a time. I mean, that came through in that Carlton example. You kind of, you do them one at a time. You can't send your paper off to 4 journals and hope that one hits home. And often you're asked to tick a box saying this is not being considered anywhere else. If it's rejected, don't just in a fit of kind of pique, you know, then immediately resubmit it somewhere else. Look at the referees' reports, think about why it was rejected, adjust it, change it, and then resubmit it. And finally, I think if you're asked to referee, you know, it's a good, you know, often being on the other side, if you like, of the desk is quite instructive for your own work. I mean, I find that, you know, I read other people's work and I think, wow, this hasn't quite, you know, it doesn't really work. Why? And then when I read my own work, I find myself making the same sorts of mistakes. I think that's it, Hyun, isn't it? Is that the end of the presentation?
It is the end of the presentation, yes.
Okay, so I've run over a little bit. 11 o'clock, isn't it? Or at least here. I know it's not 11 o'clock in Thailand, but anyway. So we're ready for Q&A, I guess.
Yes, if anyone has a question, please do ask.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. So I have a question which about my paper. I tried to submit it to, I think, 2 journals. The first one text rejected. The second one right now is already 5 months and it is set under review. One thing that I found is for the first one, they asked me to suggest the referees, but I didn't do it. But for the second one, I suggest 3 referees myself. I'm not sure if like suggest or not, like give the name or not giving any name is important or not.
Well, I can kind of briefly respond to that, and maybe Jonathan may have views that may agree with me or differ. This is very tricky. I mean, it really depends on each journal's practice. There are some people who may consider such suggestion of names for refereeing, to be a little Authors may easily suggest those who they already know, because they know the field and they have worked with various people, and they may basically the experts that they are aware of might be within their network already, especially when a paper is rather niche paper on a niche topic. Then it'll be difficult to see whether the referees nominated by the author may be able to act in a very objective way. Having said that, but there are also papers which actually editors genuinely find it difficult to locate suitable reviewers. So I had a paper recently, which is still under review, by the way, in month number 6 under review, which is on Kuwait and Kuwait housing. And basically editors telling me they've been struggling to find the reviewers and asking for some suggestion of names, which we did, but there's no guarantee the papers will be going out to these people. And I think many journals ask for names for various regions, rather than always using those names to send out the paper to those reviewers, suggested reviewers. They may be added to the list of potential reviewers for future occasion, or they may send it to 1 or 2 of them rather than the entire 3 people that were suggested. So it's difficult to know, what's really going on behind the behind the door. Yeah, I mean, Jonathan, you probably also have many experiences in this regard.
Yeah, I think you're right, Hyun. What it's becoming, I think, more common because it's getting harder and harder for journals to find reviewers. And one of the reasons why the time taken is getting so long is because people, they're just having to ask more and more people to review. And even when then they agree to review, often they never actually deliver the reference. So then you've got to start again. So that means the whole process is getting dragged out, not so much because of problems, at the journal end, but rather at our end, the kind of reviewing end. And I mean, there is discussion about, should reviewers be paid something to review? Because of course, we give our time, as reviewers 2 to 3 hours or whatever it takes. And the assumption is that we all, as long as we all do it, we're all supporting each other. So if I referee, then when I submit a paper, other people will referee my papers and so on. But it begins to break down if everyone says no. And I think it's almost getting to that point. And so I think when they ask you, can you name, any referees, they're trying to get around that. But of course, it comes up against the problem that Hyun mentioned, which is then, the danger is you just get all your friends to review for you. And the whole point of reviewing is that it is blind and it is, no one has, it's not kind of biased in any way, becomes compromised. But I think it's been driven by the practicalities of just trying to get things, moving. And I think the increase in Hyun knows this at the sharp end of desk rejection. I mean, I think a lot of journals have a sort of 80%, most papers get rejected even before they go out for review, because editors don't want to waste reviewers, referees' kind of good nature by sending them a whole bunch of papers that they feel it's just wasting their time. And I think that's where the predatory journals make a mistake, where they just sort of blanket send papers out. And it doesn't, I get asked to referee things. I mean, it's a million miles from my area of expertise. And I think, what's going on here? Clearly, they haven't done their homework. So I think editors are very careful to send papers to people that they know speak to their areas of interest. So I think if you've got, I mean, if there are names you can put them down. I mean, if you think, well, I think so-and-so would be a really good referee here, it might be someone who might be able to guess that it's your work and might not. I mean, I don't know. It depends how close they are. But I think it's editors trying to, if they've got 3 referees, they might have 1 from your list and 2 from their list. So they're maintaining a kind of the balance, if you like, in their view. They're still getting an objective view on the paper, but they're also trying to push it through in reasonable time.
And if I may just add briefly, I mean, when it comes to nominating these names, probably just nominate those who are not within your close circle, and also who are experts, so that those people who you would like to hear from, in terms of comment, those kind of people will be probably the best when it comes to nominating certain names. Yeah. So I suppose you can go for certain experts who you haven't met really in person, but who you have read, and you feel like where if I can get a kind of feedback comment from this kind of person, I'll be really I would really appreciate. So if it comes to that kind of a feeling, then maybe that's the kind of person you should nominate.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have a question. Can I ask? Okay, my name is Pavel Tabelin. I'm from Karazin Kharkiv National University, Ukraine, and I have very many thanks for your presentations. They are very interesting, very contentable. And and I have a question about a SEC transformative agreement registry. What does this register give the researchers, like discount on publication and so on? What it can be?
Is that one for you, Hyun?
Yeah, but I wasn't able to quite catch what the question was.
Okay, maybe once again, maybe I should. Sorry, now I need. Now I hearing me.
Yeah, I mean, it's breaking slightly, so it wasn't like not continuous sentence from my end.
Okay,
so,
maybe I need to enter. Okay, now I need to re-enter, and that's all.
Jonathan, were you able to catch his question?
มายังลูกเร็วๆดูเจเดี๋ยวยุงกัดอ๋อไม่ได้ค่ะเดี๋ยวยุงกัด
I think it was about the transformative agreements and
I see.
that section. I think that was that. But I don't know, maybe in the meantime, I don't know if there are any other questions.
Can you hear me?
Wait. Oh, here we are. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, try again.
Okay, try again. Okay. Oh my God. Are you hearing me? The same.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. What does the transformation agreement register give the researchers? Like publications, like discounts in publications. This because it's very interesting for me. I have never heard about this register, so please explain, because during your lecture I didn't understand the point. Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for repeating the question. I appreciate that. Transformative agreements are the agreements signed between publishers and participating institutions, which basically lead to setting up a certain amount of funding, which is covered by the participating institutions in order to benefit the researchers who are working within these institutions that are part of the agreement. So, as I was saying, by taking the example of LSE, which has been part of this arrangement, especially in the JISC, which is UK-based researchers, and also the organization. Basically, in LSE being part of the JISC arrangement, JISC body, which has signed this agreement with various publishers, and on the basis of the agreement, basically LSE is allocating a certain amount of its own budget to cover the open access publications by LSE researchers. So the only thing you need to do is you probably need to look into your own countries, whether your country has this kind of agreement, involving which participating institutions. It can be a consortium of universities, or it can be a research and a funding body that has the universities as members, or it can be individual university entering this agreement. So I was taking the example of National University of Singapore, which has recently signed this transformative agreement with publisher called Wiley. So it's a university, individual university having signed the agreement, not the Singapore Ministry of Education, for example, having signed it. Whereas in the UK, JISC, JISC, is basically having many universities within the UK as member institutions, and that JISC as the representative body, basically having signed the agreement with various publishers, including Wiley, Sage, Taylor and Francis, or other university presses, so that they were acting on behalf of many universities, but universities will have to agree to providing a certain amount of funding out of their own budget to pull the resource together, and also to basically ensure that the researchers who are working in those universities participating in JISC that has signed the agreement with participating publishers will be able to have access to the open access publication funding the university has set aside for their own university employees. And this is limited funding. It's not endless, limitless, and therefore universities will request their employees to make the basically to publish sooner than later, and ask for the funding to be made in sooner than later before it runs out in any given financial year.
I mean, just maybe two additional things to Hyun's points. I mean, firstly, I think for most of the, if you like, mainstream journals, this doesn't have a bearing on which papers are accepted. It just has a bearing on whether your paper sits behind a paywall for the journal, or whether it can be openly downloaded without your university, for example, having access to that journal. So if we want our papers to be read as widely as possible, it's obviously attractive to have it open access rather than behind a paywall. But the actual refereeing process and on the acceptance of the journal, it doesn't relate, as I understand it, in any way to whether it's open access or not. I think one of the reasons, well, the attractiveness of open access for us as scholars is that obviously anyone can read it. It doesn't matter. You can be in a university that doesn't subscribe to a journal, and you can download the paper as an academic. You can read it, which means our work is more widely disseminated, more likely to be cited, and so forth. The other thing to say is that often grants, if your research is grant funded, you can build in journal open access fees into your grant application. But I think for those scholars who don't get grants, mainly in the humanities and the social sciences, when you publish things and it's not funded by a grant, if you want it open access, as you saw in Hyun's presentation, it can be thousands of US dollars, $10,000 US. And the idea that we can find that sort of funding, that money, is just impossible. So what these sorts of agreements do is they allow people without grants to pursue open access publishing, if you like, without going down and other routes. So it means that we can publish, our work can get more widely disseminated. But the important point maybe is that just because you have this agreement, your university doesn't have any bearing on whether the paper is accepted.
So as I was kind of showing, for those who are in Thailand, and Thailand doesn't seem to be featuring in the list of agreements, which basically at the moment means there's no such arrangement for Thai researchers who are working in Thailand universities. And therefore, if you want to have such funding provided for Thai researchers within Thailand, it will be important to either persuade the government or Thai research funding bodies to have this agreement with publishers, or university also having this kind of a funding set aside for researchers. Although this is not going to be an easy task. Yes.
Mhm. So as I understand correctly, for example, if our university have this agreement with this special publishing, so if we don't have some grants for research, we have benefits to receive open access, yes, and something like that. If
Yes, the precondition is your university having the funding set aside for this purpose.
University has funding,
Yes.
yes?
Yes.
Mhm.
Basically, the money comes from the university or research funding bodies in your country, depending on who is involved in the agreement.
Okay, what's the benefits? For example, maybe compare without this agreement and with this agreement.
Whether or not the agreements are not probably important, because the most important is whether your university has set aside funding for your university researchers to be able to publish open access papers.
Mhm.
So that's
the main idea to
the
have-
starting point, yes.
So the main idea to have grants, any funding opportunities to pay for this open access. It doesn't mean it can be registered. We have registered or not. Yes. So in this case, as I understand correctly.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, if you've got other sources of funding, say through a grant, then you can use that to pay open access fees. I mean, I don't know what it's like. I mean, in the US and in the UK, if our research is publicly funded, there's a requirement for any papers to be open access. So that's actually written into one of the preconditions of accepting a grant. And I think it's the same in the US as well, and probably in kind of Canada and so forth. So we're kind of required to publish, making our research openly accessible. It can't sit behind a paywall of a journal. And I think universities therefore have kind of pushed or at least some universities have pushed this. But it's interesting, I hadn't seen that website that Hyun went on to. Obviously, for countries, well, like Thailand, it's not happening yet. That kind of means that the playing field is not a balanced one. I mean, Hyun and I can publish open access, but maybe all the scholars from Chula and elsewhere on this call can't unless they pay themselves, which strikes me as yet another instance where there is an uneven playing field for scholars in the global north like us, rich world, OECD, and scholars who aren't. And that means, I mean, I think one of the bullets that Hyun had, how do we bring scholarship from and by scholars in, if like the non-OECD countries, how do we bring that more prominently into the kind of journal kind of ecosystem? And by the look of it, this is yet another instance where it seems to lead to a slightly uneven playing field, which is a shame because we've been spending years trying to work the other way.
Just to add, I've been reviewing some grant applications, and increasingly nowadays you can see applicants asking for additional money to cover the publication cost, and in this case, open access publication. So it is possible to actually factor this into account in your grant application, even though such agreements may not be existing, so that your grant, when it is awarded, will already have a budget item that refers to your open access publication cost, so that you can use the grant money, if permitted by your grant awarding body, to cover the open access publication at a later stage of findings dissemination. Whether or not your research in a grant awarding body does allow such publication cost to be part of the budget request, that's a second story. I mean, so that's something that you may have to find out from your research funding body or your university.
Okay, thank you very much.
So probably we can have one more question before we end the session. If anyone has a question.
May I have a question?
Yes, please do.
Yeah. Thank you both of you for your useful presentation. I've got one question. According to Professor Jonathan's presentation, each paper maybe took at least 1 year or more than that for being accepted and published. So if we have to collect and analyze data, and it took maybe one or more year. Like my one of my work last year, I submit one paper, and it took a year and a half for analyzing, and then took about almost a year to being accepted. So in your opinion, or I don't know that there is a there is a academic rules or anything, that do you think that the paper seems too old or obsolete? So here is my question, because it takes a long time to analyze, and then to collect data or analyze, and then being published. So there is a rule for that.
It's a good question. I'm not sure if there's a kind of rule as such. I mean, there are some areas which are very fast moving. I mean, for example, during the early months of COVID, I think there were people trying to get early papers out as quickly as possible, and some journals turned those around particularly quickly because there was a felt need that we needed to get, okay, if you like, material out into the public sphere as quickly as possible. There are some fields of work like computer science, AI. They tend not to publish in the sort of journals that we're talking about here because it takes too long. You know, you publish something in AI and the next day it's out of date. Yeah. But I think in the humanities and many of the social sciences, actually research that was done 4 years ago, 5, is still publishable. It's not out of date. Particularly if it's not, I mean, there's sometimes research which does date quickly, so if there's a crisis event, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, for example, to be publishing things on that now would look a bit weird, well, that happened, 15 years ago. What are we doing publishing now? I think with COVID, we've moved on from the initial, what on earth's going on at that sort of moment to a more reflective style. So I think some topics and some disciplines are more, I think this issue of work becoming dated is more of an issue. I think occasionally what you need to do, though, is use the material in a different way. So you might, for example, look at the economic crisis in Thailand in 97, 98. That's nearly 3 decades ago now. But there might be an actual, reflecting back on that. What does that tell us about crisis and recovery? How can we use that, and make it relevant to 2023? So to answer your question, I don't think there's any kind of strict rule. I think some topics date more quickly than others, and you have to be aware of that. Some disciplines publish differently, like computer science. They publish in proceedings and things like that of conferences. They don't really have journals in the way that we understand it. And finally, I think that even if research maybe you feel is dated, maybe it happened 5, 6, 10 years ago, I think how you present it and what you use it to do is important. Yeah, so you're using it to make a bigger, more generic argument about something. Then I think even stuff that happened 20 years ago can still be relevant for, for now.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I think we are running out of time now. Thank you very much, Professor Huynh and Professor Jonathan. Your talk was an amazing and inspiring one. And you are very nice and kind to give us the knowledge about publication, answering the question that for us is quite difficult to find the answers. And I'm sure we have learned a lot from both of you. So thank you very much again for giving us this talk, and hope to see you soon. Enjoy the rest of your day for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I enjoyed
Thank
myself.
you.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Oh,
That's-
Hyun, Jonathan, I have a
Mhm.
question. Like, can I publish this record on YouTube or not? Because there's someone asking about, like, if we can, like, if they can see it later, like their colleagues, their friends.
Yeah.
Yeah, fine with
Yeah,
me.
I don't think we said anything that is, did we say anything that was contentious? I don't think so. So
Not-
I think
I
I'm
don't
happy
recall.
about that. Yeah, no, that's fine.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you so
fine
much.
with
Okay.
me too.
Good, great.